battleship in history. In 1941, Japan continued to attribute considerable prestige to battleships, Sunkan, and endeavored to build the largest and most powerful ships of the period. Yamato, the heaviest and most heavily army battleship in history, was launched in 1941. However, they only managed to complete Yamato and Musashi, while the third member of the class Shinano was converted to an aircraft carrier and sunk before completion. As a result of the changing technology as well as unexpected heavy losses in aircraft carriers in 1942, plans for even larger battleships, such as the Japanese Super Yamato class battleships, were cancelled. The second half of World War II saw the last battleship duels. In the Battle of Guadalcanal on 15 November 1942, the U.S. battleships USS South Dakota and Washington fought and sank the Japanese battleship Kirishima, at the cost of moderate topside damage to South Dakota. For the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japanese had to use their battleships as the main combatants, due to the heavy losses in their carrier air wings suffered in the earlier Battle of the Philippine Sea, which relegated the carriers to decoys. On 25 October 1944, 6 battleships, led by Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf of the U.S. 7th Fleet, fired upon and claimed credit for sinking Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's battleships Yamashio and Fuss during the Battle of Surigao Strait. In fact, both battleships were fatally crippled by torpedo attacks from destroyers before being brought under fire by Oldendorf's battleships, and probably only Yamashio was the target of their fire. Thanks to the Japanese carriers' successfully decoy role, the Battle of Samar on the 25th of October, 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf showed battleships could still be useful. However, the persistent American air attacks coupled with the indecision of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita and the fight by American destroyers and destroyer escorts saved the American escort carriers of Taffy 3 from destruction by the gunfire of Yamato Kong, Haruna, and Nagato and their cruiser escort. Miraculously for the Americans, only one escort carrier, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort were lost in this action. Ultimately, the maturity of air power spelled doom for the battleship. Battleships in the Pacific ended up primarily performing shore bombardment and anti-aircraft defense for the carriers. Only the fast battleships, formerly battle cruisers, of the Congo class saw much action due to their speed, while the slower and heavier battleships were held in reserve for a decisive engagement of battleships versus battleships, which never really happened. Yamato and Musashi were sunk by air attacks long before coming in gun range of American Fleet. 67 aircraft carriers. The Shikoku shortly after completion in August 1941 in the 1920s. The Kiga, originally laid down as a battleship, and a similar ship, the Akijai, originally laid down as a battle cruiser, were converted to aircraft carriers, Kukan, to satisfy the terms of the Washington Naval Treaty. 68. From 1935–1938, Akiji and Kiga received extensive rebuilds to improve their aircraft handling capacity. 68. Japan put particular emphasis on aircraft carriers. The Imperial Japanese Navy started the Pacific War with 10 aircraft carriers. 69. The largest and most modern carrier fleet in the world at that time. There were 8 American aircraft carriers at the beginning of hostilities, 70, only 3 operating in the Pacific, and 8 British aircraft carriers, of which a single one operated in the Indian Ocean. A large number of these Japanese carriers were of small size, however, in accordance with the limitations placed upon the Navy by the London and Washington Naval Conferences. Nonetheless, the Japanese initially had the upper hand over the American and British. by grouping all of their fleet carriers into a single unit known as the 1st Air Fleet or Kid Butai, Mobile Force. In the Kid Butai, the Tushkaku-class carriers were superior to any carrier in the world, until the wartime appearance of the American Essex-class NB5, following the Battle of Midway, in which 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sunk. The IJN suddenly found itself short of fleet carriers, as well as trained air crews, robbing them of a strategic offensive capability. The IJN consequently undertook an ambitious set of projects to convert commercial and military vessels into carriers, such as the Hie. Another conversion project, Shinano, was based on an incomplete Yamato-class super battleship and became the largest displacement carrier of World War II. One exception was the Tai, which was the only Japanese carrier with an armored flight deck and first to incorporate a closed hurricane. All 3 mid-war designs were sunk in 1944, with Shinano and Tai being sunk by U.S. submarines, and Hie by air attacks. The IJN also attempted to build a number of fleet carriers called Fury class, mostly based on the older Hyori design rather than the newer Shikaku or Tai for the sake of reducing construction cost and time. Most carriers were still under construction or cancelled by the end of war, while the few completed ships never embarked air groups due to severe shortages of carrier-qualified aircrew. Destroyers. Japanese World War II destroyers, Kachukukan, included some of the most formidable destroyers of their day. This came as a nasty surprise to the Allies, who had generally underestimated Japanese technical capabilities. The Japanese had reassessed their naval needs in the mid-1920s and, placing an emphasis on ship and weapons technology and night fighting expertise, developed a completely new destroyer design. Subsequent development from one destroyer class to the next was not, however, a smooth progression. Aside from the usual changes arising from experience, serious design faults also came to light and naval treaties imposed restrictions. As a result, the early special type destroyers required significant changes and the specifications of subsequent classes was reduced in one way or another. Naval treaties were later abrogated in 1937 and so destroyer development continued without regard to limits. Generally speaking, the Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, requirements gave rise to warships that were substantially larger than their European or American equivalents, often well equipped with heavy torpedo armament for surface engagements but with less emphasis on anti-aircraft or anti-submarine armament. In early war years, their advantages were exploited against the often second-rate and poorly coordinated Allied ships stationed in the region, such as at the IJN victory in the Battle of the Yava Sea. The Japanese did not, however, continue to install new technology, such as radar, to match their opponents, and destroyer numbers were eroded steadily in the latter half of the Pacific War. The Japanese emphasis on capable but expensive fleet destroyers had neglected the need for large numbers of cheaper escort vessels, destroyer escorts or frigates, to defend critical merchantmen, a need learned by both the Royal Navy and the United States Navy in the Battle of the Atlantic. In recognition that quantity was as important as quality in some roles, design policy was therefore modified to produce units that were easier to build and operate. Despite this, Japan's destroyer force was halved by the end of the war. The survivors were given to the Allies. Naval aviation. Planes on the deck of an aircraft carrier, with technical crews in white overalls attending the planes. Planes from the Japanese aircraft carrier Shikaku preparing the attack in Pearl Harbor. Japan began the war with a highly competent naval air force designed around some of the best airplanes in the world. The A6M0 was considered the best carrier aircraft of the beginning of the year. The Mitsubishi G3M bomber was remarkable for its range and speed, and the Kawanishi H-8K was the world's best flying boat. NB6. The Japanese pilot corps at the beginning of the war were of high caliber as compared to their contemporaries around fuel due to intense training and frontline experience in the Sino-Japanese War. NB7. The Navy also had a competent land-based tactical bombing force based around the Mitsubishi G3M and G4M bombers, which astonished the world by being the first planes to sink enemy capital ships underway, claiming battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse. 7. As the war progressed, the Allies found weaknesses in Japanese naval aviation. Though most Japanese sea aircraft were characterized by great operating range and agility, they had very little in the way of defensive armament and armor. 73. As a result, the more numerous, heavily armed and armored American aircraft were able to develop techniques that nullified the advantages of the Japanese aircraft. The early carrier versus carrier naval battles in 1942, such as Coral Sea and Santa Cruz Island, were tactical victories for the IJN, but they suffered disproportionately higher crew losses compared to the US Navy. The IJN did not have an efficient process for rapid As the war progressed, the Allies found weaknesses in Japanese naval aviation. Though most Japanese sea aircraft were characterized by great operating range and agility, they had very little in the way of defensive armament and armor. 73. As a result, the more numerous, heavily armed and armored American aircraft were able to develop techniques that nullified the advantages of the Japanese aircraft. The early carrier versus carrier naval battles in 1942, such as Coral Sea and Santa Cruz Island, were tactical victories for the IJN, but they suffered disproportionately higher crew losses compared to the US Navy. The IJN did not have an efficient process for rapid training of aviators, as 2 years of training were usually considered necessary for a carrier flyer. Therefore, they were not able to effectively replace seasoned pilots lost through combat attrition following their initial successes in the Pacific Campaign. 73. The inexperience of IJN pilots who were trained in the later part of the war was especially evident during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, when their aircraft were shot down in droves by the American naval pilots in what the Americans later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Following the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese Navy increasingly opted towards deploying aircraft in the kamikaze role. Airplane on a tarmac with trees in the background. Japan's first jet-powered aircraft, the Imperial Japanese Navy's Nakajima J-9 Waikika, 1945, although there were delays in engine development. 74. Several new competitive aircraft designs were developed during the war. But industrial weaknesses, lack of raw materials and disorganization due to Allied bombing raids hampered their mass production. Towards the end of the conflict, several competitive plane designs were developed, such as the 1943 Shiden, but such planes were reproduced too late and in insufficient numbers, 415 units for the Shiden, to affect the outcome of the war. 75. Radical new plane designs were also developed, such as the canard design Shinden, and especially jet-powered aircraft such as the Nakajima Kika and rocket-propelled Mitsubishi J-8M Shuzley. These jet designs were partially based on technology received from Nazi Germany, usually in the form of a few drawings only. Kika being based on the Messerschmitt Me 262 and the J-8M on the Messerschmitt Me 163, so Japanese manufacturers had to play a key role in the final engineering. 76. These developments also happened too late in the conflict to have any influence on the outcome. The Kicker only flew twice before the end of the war. 77 submarines. Full-length side view of a submarine on the sea. An Imperial Japanese Navy I-400 class submarine. The largest submarine type of World War II. Japan had by far the most varied fleet of submarines of World War II, including manned torpedoes, Kaiten, midget submarines, Kyoryuki, Kyoryu, medium-range submarines, purpose-built supply submarines, many for use by the Army, long-range fleet submarines, many of which carried an aircraft